According to psychologist Dr. Saul Kassan, false confessions can be divided into 3 types: voluntary, persuaded, and compliant. Voluntary self-confessions are when somebody comes in and they just confess immediately without any pressure from the police, the public, media, or any sort of other major authority. They just come in and claim it was them. This happens for a handful of reasons. It's commonly associated with some sort of underlying psychiatric issue. Either it's attention-seeking behavior. They want the infamy of being responsible for this even though they're not responsible for it in any way, shape, or form. Or maybe they want to be punished, and so they feel that if they confess to this crime, whether they committed it or not, it's a way for them to end up receiving some sort of punishment for whatever they feel they need to be punished for. Another potential rationale is when somebody is just completely out of touch with reality. They may truly believe that they committed this crime, or they may be unsure whether or not they committed it because they don't have a strong grasp on where they are in place and time, and so they just assume it was them. Thirdly, and this is the most practical reason why somebody would just come in and confess, is because they're trying to protect somebody. Usually this would be a case where they're trying to protect the actual perpetrator. An example would be if a mother comes in and confesses to a crime because she knows her son did it, or a husband comes in and confesses to a crime because he doesn't want his wife to go to prison. And interestingly, investigators are actually a lot more skeptical of a voluntary self-confession than they are of a persuaded self-confession. When you think of a false self-confession, you're probably thinking of a persuaded self-confession. This is when somebody comes in for interrogation, they are innocent, and then they are, and I mean this in the true sense of the word, gaslit into believing that they did in fact commit this crime. And this could be for a lot of reasons. Either investigators truly think that they committed this crime and their confirmation bias has resulted in them using unethical tactics to get the answer that they believe to be correct, or there's a lot of public pressure on this case, the case isn't going anywhere, and the investigators are feeling like they just need to wrap this thing up so that people can feel satisfied that there's been a result. And when people hear of instances like this, it is a sort of knee-jerk reaction to be like, okay, but I would never commit to something that I knew that I didn't do. So that makes me suspicious that they either actually did do this, or at the very least they've done other bad things. Like, why would you confess to something that you know you didn't do? There's a few tactics that go into all of this, and actually most people are a lot more likely to fall into this trap than they might believe. Because the tactics that they use is, one, investigators will pull on false accounts. They'll say, okay, well, you're saying you didn't do this, but eyewitnesses have testified to seeing you at the scene. Are you sure that you didn't have some sort of blip, or maybe you've repressed the memory? When the reality is that there are no eyewitnesses. Nobody has attested to seeing them at the scene. The other and arguably biggest contributing factor to these false confessions is also that these interrogations tend to be incredibly long. So you'll become hungry, you'll become stressed, you'll become sleep deprived, and the longer that you're in that state, the less lucid you become, and it is a lot easier to undermine somebody's sense of self and their trust in their own memory system. And investigators are aware of this, and in fact they're relying on it. So during this super long, arduous period of time, they'll just consistently tell you, we know that you did it. We have evidence that you did it. People saw you do it. I think that you just repressed this memory. And eventually it gets to a point where you truly are like, did I repress the memory? They have all of this evidence against me. Maybe I did do it. And your brain is just seeking some sort of relief to get out of this situation. And the easiest way to get out of it is when the investigators are telling you repeatedly, this can all stop if you just admit it was you. And again, as human beings, we are a lot more predisposed to something like this happening and working than we would like to admit. In fact, Dr. Kassan did an experiment with his students where he told them when they were typing on their computers, hey, don't press the Alt key. If you press the Alt key, it's messed up. The computer will shut down. And he had actually programmed the computers to shut down regardless of whether or not the Alt key had been hit just after a certain period of time. So as the students are typing on their computers, eventually the computer would shut down, they hadn't hit the Alt key. And Dr. Kassan would say, okay, but the computer shut down, you did do it. Actually, the kid sitting next to you, he just told me that he saw you do it. And well, initially the students were very confident that they didn't hit the Alt key. I mean, that was his one thing that he said, don't hit the Alt key. And it had only been a couple minutes, so of course they didn't forget already. After a while of him repeatedly asserting that they definitely hit the Alt key, he saw them hit it, they saw them hit it, all these other people saw them hit it, the computer wouldn't have shut down if they didn't hit it. It's not like the computer would just shut down. Then a lot of the students started recanting and saying, oh, maybe I did just hit it without realizing. I mean, I guess that's true. Like, why would the computer just shut off if I didn't hit the Alt key? And as you may have guessed, today's Spooky Saturday case involves not one, not two, but several rounds of false confessions. This case actually takes place in my hometown of Austin, Texas, back in the 90s, and it's still a cold case today, in large part due to the fact that investigators were sort of shoehorning in suspects rather than relying on the evidence that they actually did have, that they knew actually did exonerate a lot of these children. Because of this, the investigators ultimately wasted a lot of time, a lot of resources, and several years of these young men's lives purely because they couldn't withstand the public pressure of not having answers for these brutal murders of these young girls by complete and total strangers at their workplace. This is the story of 4 young girls doing what young girls do, working a part-time job at a yogurt shop, only to end up essayed, brutally murdered, and set on fire. Hey guys, welcome back. Like I said, I'm gonna be doing away with the black wigs. I know you guys love them, but it takes so much extra time. I've just added a lot of long form projects on top of all of my daily TikTok tasks, and I don't have like a huge team behind me or something like that. It's really just me, except for the podcast. I have a producer. I just have to cut that part of the process out because it takes so much extra time. I'm sorry. I know that you guys loved them and I loved them too, but it's just not practical. So from now on, it's just gonna be brown hair Daisy. Like I said in the intro, today's case is actually one that hits super close to home. It didn't just happen in Austin, Texas, where if you've been subscribed for a while, you know that that's where I'm originally from, but it actually happened in Austin, right near where I grew up. So I know all of the locations present in this case. It's actually places where I used to hang out as a teenager very frequently. I used to go to the Froyo shop right in this same shopping center where all of this happened, which is like horrifying after knowing about this because I had no idea about these murders. I went to the same mall that these girls were at in this same story on a very regular basis, and it's not uncommon for kids to go out in Texas in high school and just like hang out in the parking lot by Whataburger or by Froyo, just because there's only so much that you can do. Especially in the 90s, because when I was growing up in Austin, Austin was a much smaller city than it is now. It's built up a ton in just the last like 10 years. And I went to school downtown, but I lived in North Austin. So all of these environments I can perfectly visualize because I was doing the same thing that these girls were doing. And in fact, a lot of these girls remind me of friends that I have, of girls that I grew up with, because a lot of the things that they're doing are sort of like stereotypical Texas girl hobbies, Texas girl things to do. And so each girl that I was learning about, I was like, huh, that's just like my friend Paige, or like, whoa, that's just like my friend Sarah. Oh, I remember when Jessica was on that same sort of team, or oh, I remember when my friend Ryan went and did the rodeo just like that. And because of that, it's extra real to me. And so that's why I decided to pick this case. So without further ado, let's get into it. I'm going to start with each of the victims from oldest to youngest. So we're going to be starting with Jennifer Harbison. Jennifer was very extroverted and well-liked at school. She was actually president of the local chapter of Future Farmers of America, which if you're not from Texas, that might sound like silly to you, but it's actually a really cool organization that prepares young people to get into agriculture, and they actually do a lot of really useful programs. And her being president of the local chapter is a really big deal, but she was actually also vice president of that entire district. So she wasn't just involved in that program, she was leading that program. She was a community leader at her school. But her extracurriculars don't just stop there. She was actually a track and field star as well. And she was routinely in the rodeo doing barrel racing. And she was really, really good at barrel racing. If you didn't grow up riding horses, you might not know what that looks like, but it's exactly what it sounds like. They have a bunch of barrels, you weave in and out of them, and it is really, really cool. I grew up riding both Western and English, so I have a strong appreciation for her involvement in that, and she ain't no slouch. That stuff is hard, especially on that level. With all of these activities and these leadership roles, it comes as no surprise that Jennifer was fiercely independent. And because of this, her mom felt comfortable allowing her to get a part-time job at a local yogurt shop because her birth father had found this really cool Chevy truck that he was trying to get for her. And so she pleaded with her mom like, hey, I want to get a part-time job so I can save up, put some money towards the truck. And her mom complied. She felt like this was character building. It was a good thing to put on her resume that she had a part-time job in high school, and it's something that she seemed really excited and motivated to do, so why not? The next victim is tragically Jennifer's younger sister, Sarah Harbison, who was just 15 years of age at this time. Sarah had a lot of similar interests as her older sister. She also loved sports. It was something that she was incredibly dedicated to. She was on the basketball team. She was actually so dedicated to being involved in sports that she joined the cheerleading squad as well, and so she would go from playing basketball to cheering on the sideline directly after her own games, because her games would happen directly before the boys' basketball games. And so even though a lot of other kids would be like, that's too much, I would be tired, it didn't matter. Sarah was dedicated. She had that level of tenacity. She also ended up joining the freshman volleyball team shortly after this, and she excelled. But this wasn't enough extracurriculars for Sarah. She also became a representative on her high school student council of the Linear FFA chapter. But we still haven't even gotten into Sarah's very favorite extracurricular activity, which was to show sheep at the local county fair with her sister Jennifer. And that was something that they bonded over doing, and it was a mutual favorite activity of theirs. They were incredibly close. Even though Sarah was incredibly close with her older sister Jennifer, you still gotta have friends, and she found a best friend in Amy Lee Ayes. Amy was your quintessential Texas girl. She was fully invested in the ranching and cowgirl lifestyle from a very, very young age. Howdy. Had to go grab my cowboy hat for my girl, but Amy really was like a classic Texas horse girl. She started competing in competitions as young as 3 years old, and she was actually cleaning up. I used to teach kids at camp how to ride horses every single summer, and we would do a little horse show at the end of the year where we would have kids with whistles, make different formations and stuff. We'd have barrel racing, we'd have cutting, we'd have basically everything that a typical rodeo would have. With that said, I can't emphasize enough how well Amy was actually doing, because she was competing in cutting horses. That's not like an animal abuse thing. Cutting horses is when your horse takes on a more aggressive position, where there's a whole group of cattle and you're trying to cut one cattle out of the group and isolate them and keep them away from the rest of the group. It's an incredibly difficult thing to do, especially because when they're all in a herd like that, they really do move as one. If you're a pop culture person, you may have seen like Bella Hadid recently was in a horse competition. And if you don't know what you're looking at, it looks kind of weird. She's going low, her horse is doing one of these, and that's because she was competing in cutting, which is actually quite advanced. So Amy really was a very strong equestrian. It's also worth noting that cutting horses is typically more male dominated. So not only is she doing something that's really, really difficult, she's doing something that's not as common for women to participate in the equestrian space. On top of that, she just had a general love for animals. She would train her dogs really, really well. She would help other people with their pets. She would go fishing routinely. She loved participating in the county fair, where she would regularly show hogs, and she also had a creative side. She would participate in their art competitions. And then on top of that, she was also a part of the Future Farmers organization, and she was the vice president at Lanier High School, which is how these girls came in contact with one another. It's also worth noting that Amy's dream was ultimately to become a veterinarian and to grow up and own a horse farm. And with everything that she was doing, I think that that is a wholly practical aspiration for her. I absolutely believe that she would have realized that dream as an adult. Our final victim is Eliza Thomas, who is 17 years old. A favored pastime of Eliza's, which is also very quintessential Texas girl, was that she loved country music and she loved to go out dancing, and she would actually dance events. So there's a few different ways that you can traditionally dance in Texas. In our public schools, you do have to learn how to line dance and square dance as well. So usually that's where it starts for most girls who get into more traditional Western style dancing. But she was really close with her mother. Her parents were divorced, but she still maintained a very close relationship with her mother. And so she would go out, she would dance these events, and she would come back to her mom, and her mom would do these sort of like homemade photo shoots to celebrate the experience while she was all dressed up in her nice dancing clothes and had her hair and her makeup done. And her mother would say that those were her most cherished memories with Eliza. Eliza was sort of new friends with the other three girls because Jennifer had only been working at the yogurt shop for a couple months, but they did still have a lot in common. She also liked to show hogs at the state fair, and on top of that, she was really beautiful. She aspired to be a model one day, and she would collect lipstick because of this. She got really, really good at makeup and hair, and she actually also used to collect those miniature figurines. She preferred the cat ones. An officer from the APD was patrolling North Austin when he noticed a large plume of smoke. And where there's smoke, there's fire. So he called it in. He was actually one of the first people to see it. So he called it in very early. And Texas is hot, Texas is dry, so it's not uncommon for there to be fires in Texas. He didn't really think anything of it beyond just a typical fire. I mean, of course, they're worried, like, what if people are in there? What if people are hurt? But he wasn't suspicious or anything upon seeing it. When the firefighters arrived, just like the officer who had initially called it in, they believed that this was just an after-hours fire, and they put it out as quickly as possible, only to then realize that this was not an after-hours fire. This was a very clear case of arson with the motive of covering up a quadruple murder of 4 teenage girls. Once the fire was out, a shocking scene was revealed. The charred bodies of sisters Sarah and Jennifer, as well as their friend Eliza, were all stacked on top of each other in the back of the shop, while the body of 13-year-old Amy Ayers was found just a few feet away. And based on the position of her corpse, it is believed that she had actually survived the initial attack and attempted to crawl away to escape and was unsuccessful. All 4 of the girls had been stripped completely naked, bound, and then shot execution style. And because of this, it is absolutely shocking that Amy was able to even get as far away from the bodies of the other girls as she did before eventually succumbing to her wounds. And I wish that that was the full extent of the brutality that these 4 young girls had experienced, but it's not, because several of the girls had signs that indicated that prior to their executions, they had been assaulted. This sight was so horrific that the original detective on the case, John Jones, was quoted by saying, "I had seen homicides before, but not 4, and not 4 all tied up, and not 4 stripped down, and not 4 burned." The way that all 4 of the girls found themselves in the yogurt shop at the same time was because the 2 younger girls, Amy and Sarah, had come to an agreement with Jennifer that she would drive them to the mall, and then they would go out and they would go shopping for a little bit, meet up back at the yogurt shop, wait for her to close down, and then drive home together and have a sleepover. And of course, their mother agreed to this because this is just super normal. I mean, I had that exact same routine more times than I could possibly count when I was in high school. But that still begs the question of, what was the motive? Why them? If they were just doing what pretty much everybody else does in high school, why would they be targeted, especially by presumably complete strangers? It was the night shift, and it was clear upon further investigation that Jennifer and Eliza had in fact locked up the shop and were getting ready to leave. In fact, there were eyewitnesses, a couple that had come in just before closing, got some yogurt, and left, and they said that when they left, they remembered Eliza locking the door behind them. They were genuinely the last people who were supposed to be in the shop that night before it closed. And when the firefighters came to address the burning building, they still found that that front door was locked. And actually, the only door on the entire building that wasn't locked was the employee back entrance door, the emergency exit in the back of the kitchen that is legally required in the event that there is a fire. So it seems that the girls had locked up the front of the shop so that more customers wouldn't come in, and then they were just doing their closing duties of cleaning everything up, making sure everything's set for the morning shift, and basically just doing their jobs. And meanwhile, Sarah and Amy would have just been patiently waiting for the older girls to be done so that they could head home. It's believed that the motive was a robbery. It's believed that the motive for breaking into the yogurt shop, at least initially, was robbery, because the yogurt shop was robbed, and it does seem that they had actually cased the building, and that's how they knew that they would have to go in through the back. And there are instances where people break in to businesses with the motive of just robbing that business. Things go wrong, and it goes from a robbery to a homicide. But the brutality of this case, the fact that it wasn't just like the people who had broken in were confronted, panicked, or like the girls did something wrong, they made a jerky movement, and then they got shot. It clearly goes far beyond that. It doesn't seem like an impulsive decision at all. The girls were bound, the girls were assaulted, the girls were shot execution style. So they clearly were not going to let these girls live. They were not going to let them be witness to the other crimes that they committed post-robbery. A lot of the times when people rob businesses, they do so with their face covered, and they don't talk if they don't have to, or they do a fake voice to try and make it difficult for them to be identified. But I personally think that the motive goes far beyond robbery, because it's just so sadistic that it just seems like it was an integral part of this plan, especially because it's believed that there were multiple assailants during this case. And I don't know about you, but I find it hard to believe that the initial plan was to go in and commit a robbery, even though these guys are criminals, even though they're breaking the law, even though they might be morally corrupt. I find it hard to believe that like up to potentially 4 men is what they believe. Only one of them would come in and escalate things to that level, and then the other 3 would just go along with it. I just feel like that is such like a huge jump in crimes that though it's possible that it could be an impulsive decision, I do feel like this was probably something that was always planned, especially because if they were casing this business, they would know that these 2 teenage girls were the ones closing the store. So at the very least, I feel that there was a grosser motive here, at least concerning Jennifer and Eliza. Because if this was something that was planned in advance, the fact that Amy and Sarah were there would be a sort of unknown variable. And I'm sure that they were lurking around the area before the business closed, so I'm sure they were aware that they were there. But I don't know, it just seems like something that would require a little bit more thought than just your typical B&E. And when this case happened, this was a huge case in Austin. I mean, at this time, Austin's like a major city now, but it was still like a small, big city. You know, it's a capital, but it was still a small, big city. And even to this day, if you grew up in Austin, you kind of know everybody. Even though there's like millions of people there, you have at least one point of connection with everybody else, at least if you spend any time downtown. It's rare for me to visit Austin without running into like a million people that I know. This case really shook the area, especially because of the age of the victims and because of how senseless it all was. The owners of the yogurt shop actually offered a $150,000 cash reward for anybody who could give any information that could result in a potential conviction, or at the very least result in them taking this thing to court. There were billboards everywhere. People were doing public memoriams for these girls. But because a lot of the evidence had been burned and washed away, APD was having a very difficult time narrowing down their suspects. They actually had 532 different suspects throughout the course of the first 2 years of this case, and they had pursued 5,000 different leads within that same 2-year period. And despite the fact that this case was being taken incredibly seriously and that APD was really resolute in trying to find something, anything, no one was arrested in connection with this case for 8 years due to lack of evidence. Just because no one was arrested didn't mean that police didn't think that they knew who did it. In fact, there were 4 teenage boys that they believed were responsible for this quadruple homicide, but they were unable to do anything because they didn't have enough evidence. At least that is till 1999, when new investigators were put on the case, and the first thing that they did was arrest and charge those 4 suspects. Maurice, Forrest, Michael, and Robert had since become adults in the last 8 years. At the time of the murders, Maurice, who was just 16 years old, had been arrested for having a .22 caliber on him inside the mall that was right by this yogurt shop where Sarah and Amy had just been. And when investigators asked Maurice where he had been on the night of the murders, just the night before, he told them that his friend Forrest, who was just 15 years old, had actually borrowed his gun the day before and he hadn't had it on him. And it wasn't long before Robert and Michael got pulled into the mix as well, who were just 16 and 17 at the time, because on the day of the murders, they had actually been all hanging out together just earlier that day around the very same area that this mall and this yogurt shop was in. But again, just like I said for the 4 girls, hanging out at a mall or even in the parking lot or nearby this shopping center that had this yogurt shop, that's pretty typical Texas teenager behavior. There's nothing really inherently suspicious about that. And even though a minor in Texas shouldn't be carrying a .22 caliber, it's also sort of not unheard of. There are a lot of guns in Texas and a lot of people have a lot of feelings about that, but it is, just to be clear, not really outside the realm of normalcy down in Texas, especially not in the 90s. When the 4 boys were first interrogated in 1999, that is, all of them maintained their innocence, at least initially. As time went on, Robert and Michael, the 16 and 17-year-old boys, they actually did change their story. Over the course of hours and days of questioning, Maurice and Forrest, the 2 younger boys who were just 14 and 15 years old, they sustained their story. They didn't have anything to do with this. They would never hurt those girls. But the first egg to crack was Michael, the 16-year-old boy. After days and days of interrogation, rough interrogation, constant questioning, Michael eventually cracked. Even though he was no longer this 16-year-old boy that he had been when this case was first being processed, he now, as an adult man, fell victim to the pressure. And after this extensive questioning, he would go from his initial statements of, I don't know anything about this case, like I wasn't involved, to then admitting to having shot 2 then teenage girls and sexually assaulting one of them. Similarly, Robert, who had for years now sustained that he wasn't within 100 yards of that yogurt shop, went from those sorts of statements to admitting to having shot and one of those teenage girls. But he didn't just stop there. He actually also sustained that all of his 3 friends were also involved. And so because of this, all 4 of these men were charged. Maurice and Forrest, who had sustained for 8 years now that they were not involved and never cracked under the pressure, were ultimately not indicted, and they were eventually released from these charges. So just Michael and Robert would move on through the process and end up being forced to defend themselves in court. And in 2001, Michael and Robert would be found guilty and convicted to not only life in prison, but Michael was also given the death penalty. All of this without any physical evidence, all of this just going off of these confessions. So there was no physical evidence, just these confessions, which happened after hours and days of intense interrogation, and the potential murder weapon was ruled to probably not be the murder weapon. But despite this, Michael and Robert, they were already convicted. They were in jail. And in 2005, Robert would actually have his conviction overturned. And just 2 years later, so would Michael. This meant that both men had to be retried. And upon retrial, it was found that their Sixth Amendment rights had been violated because these confession tapes were used against them, but they weren't given the opportunity to cross-examine the witnesses against them, which were the investigators. So they didn't get to speak to their experiences, and they didn't get to speak to whether or not this investigation was ethically conducted. The men's lawyers argued that this was a clear case of a false confession, that they were berated for hours and days and eventually broke under pressure. And despite the fact that these confessions did have some concerning details, like they said exactly what gun they had used, which we now know was likely not the murder weapon, and they did speak to the position of one of the bodies, which it's unclear whether or not their description of the bodies was accurate or just vague enough that it could be shoehorned into being accurate. It was ultimately decided that there's just not enough evidence for these men to be getting life sentences and being put on death row. But there was also new technological advances that led to new evidence being discovered due to YSCR testing, which is when they take a partial DNA sample from a victim and then they compare it with their lineage to see if there's any male relative that shares this DNA with them. It was discovered that in Amy's body, the male samples that were present that were indicative of assault, they didn't match Michael or Robert. In other words, they're not the ones who her. Because of this, the charges were dropped. And I'm sure that this came as a huge relief to these men and their families, but it also created a situation where the families of these 4 girls who had been trying to process this horrifying tragedy, who thought that after 8 years they finally had some semblance of closure, now this wound has been reopened. They're now learning that actually they still don't know who did it. And actually the people who really did it are probably still walking around Austin today. And actually they have been putting all of their anger, or maybe even forgiveness, some people choose that route, towards these men who didn't have anything to do with it. And before you think that I'm letting these men off too easily, that, you know, we don't actually know if this is a fully false confession, maybe there were other things at play, it is important to note that these 2 confessions, they weren't the only ones that were deemed unlikely and unusable in the end. There was actually a total of 7 written confessions by other suspects that APD had submitted over the years that were all eventually thrown out. Michael and Robert's confessions were just the only ones that actually led to a formal conviction. But APD had tried to push through all 7 of these confessions over the years to no avail. That paints a pretty damning picture. And this isn't to say that these investigators are evil or messed up or anything like that, but it absolutely speaks to the level of desperation that there is to try and solve this case, to get it wrapped up, to figure out what happened, to find closure for these families and the overall community. And because of that, things weren't being conducted the way that they're supposed to be. And the sheer number of confessions really muddies the water, because maybe one of these, at least one of these 7, was legitimate, and there just wasn't enough evidence to back it, but the confession itself is true. That would still mean that at least 6 of these other confessions would still be false confessions that could be made for any of the 3 reasons that I listed in the intro of this video. And when you don't have evidence to back a confession, it makes it very difficult to know, is it true or is it false? And especially when there's this high level of investment, this high level of public visibility, this high level of media attention, it puts a lot of pressure on the investigators. And actually, if you look at statistics from the Innocence Project, you see that 29% of those exonerations included a false confession that was then wiped clean due to DNA evidence, either exonerating this person fully, pinpointing that their alibi was correct, or proving that it couldn't have possibly been them and it was someone else. So that's more than 1 in 4 DNA exonerations, according to the Innocence Project. That's a pretty high ratio. And after 2009, when Michael and Robert were released, the case again sort of went stale. It hit a standstill. And all investigators could really do, now that they had this newfound YSTR testing, was to test it against other potential people until they eventually found a match. And because it's partial DNA, it is a little bit more difficult. You don't find like a direct exact match the same way that you normally would. So it kind of complicated things, although it was still a step in a positive direction. It got to a point where they had tested over 100 men and they hadn't found anyone who matched. And they wouldn't find anyone who matched for another 8 years. So the way that it works is it finds if somebody is from the same male lineage of whoever the sample is taken from. So that's what I mean when I say that it's not as direct, where it's not like, oh, it's this person. But you might have a match where it's like, oh, whoever this partial DNA is from, we have a match on somebody who could be an uncle, a father, a cousin, a son. And when I say that it can get really indirect, I mean like it can be a random cousin on your dad's side of the family because it follows male lineage that you don't even know exists. And that can complicate things, especially when you come from a really big family. Again, while this is a step in a positive direction, things do get complicated here because the match that they found was from a population study that had been conducted by the FBI. And because it was a population study and because it was from the FBI, the identity of this person had been fully redacted. So though they did find a match, which could be anybody from like an immediate family member, like a father or a brother, it didn't really matter because they don't know who the match is. They don't have the identity of this person still. And what's more frustrating is the FBI can't declassify the identification because it's a constitutional breach of the person who provided their DNA randomly for the sake of this study. It violates their rights. So even though the FBI may want to make this information declassified, they're in a constitutional bind. And what is really unfortunate about this sort of DNA testing is it's actually proved to solve several other cold cases by now. One of the more notable ones being the Boston Strangler, when they found a DNA connection between the murderer and his nephew through this exact same process. So it's incredibly frustrating to hit a wall at this point because this could very well be the piece of evidence that finally cracks open the case and finally gives the true identity of whoever did this, at least one of the people who may have done this. But tragically, since 2017, there haven't been any further developments. I don't know if we'll ever reach a point where the FBI can somehow contact this person and ask if they're willing to reveal their identity. I don't know if they're constitutionally allowed to do that. I have a suspicion that were they allowed to do that, they would have already done that, and we would be moving forward with an answer of this person has or hasn't given their consent. What's unfortunate is if we ever did reach that point and the person decided not to give their consent, it could be for a myriad of reasons. It could be because they are worried about incriminating a brother or a cousin or their father, or it could just be because they didn't agree to have their identity attached to their DNA in this sort of way to be used by investigators. And it could just be something that they don't believe in participating in, unfortunately. But again, we would have to get to a point where the FBI is even allowed to ask this person that, which I don't think, as of at least right now, that they are. I do believe that they're still trying to find other matches. So maybe somebody else in the family will do an Ancestry.com test, and then it'll suddenly flag somebody who's not anonymous and is related to this person, and they'll pop up in the system and we'll finally get an answer. But until that day comes, which hopefully it does, especially with the rise in popularity as far as those testing kits are concerned, the families of these 4 girls are just unfortunately stuck with a lack of legitimate long-term resolution as far as this case is concerned. And it really is truly incredibly sad and an absolutely devastating blow to the Austin community, even 30 years later. Hopefully in a couple months or a couple years, I'll be able to make a follow-up video on this case and we'll find that there's been a resolution, but until then, this is all that we know. If you guys made it this far, thank you so much for watching the entire video. It really does help me, and if you did like this video, maybe like it in a literal sense, because that also helps me. And if you're not subscribed, I would appreciate it. It would make my day. I'm trying to hit 10K subs. I haven't hit it yet, but I'm getting closer every day, so I'm really looking forward to hopefully hitting that milestone soon. As always, thank you guys so much for your support. Please let me know what you think in the comments. I don't like to do cases that lack resolution because I find them just really so frustrating, and I really feel for like the families of these victims, and the lack of justice, it makes the whole thing, which is already like so painful and traumatic, a lot more painful and traumatic, because it's just like, oh my gosh, like when something terrible happens, you kind of hold on to the fact that like, okay, but at least we're gonna get this guy, you know? And when you're dealing with a case that's at a point where they don't have that, and they haven't had that for a long time, and it's been long enough that people are wondering if they ever will, it just makes it all the more devastating. Even still, I really wanted to talk about this one, especially because it hits so close to home, and I had no idea about this case even still until my boyfriend showed it to me earlier this week. Definitely let me know what you think in the comments. And if you haven't watched this week's podcast episode, it just dropped yesterday, so it is still brand new. Definitely catch up, check it out, let me know what you think, and I'll see you next week. Bye!